All right, here we go, guys. Welcome
Sounds good.
to Silicon Zombies, where we're coming live from Los Gatos. This is 92.9 FM in Los Gatos, 101.9 FM in Santa Cruz, and pretty jazzed to have us here. Before we do a shout out to our guests, which we're going to be exploring a little bit about SB 1047.
It's super loud on my side.
Is it? How about now? Okay, that's live radio, folks. Okay, cool. We're gonna put these back on, and just really grateful to be here. And what we're going to be able to cover a little bit is public policy around artificial intelligence and what comes next. So before we get into the thick of that, you are listening to Pirate Cat Radio, and we're really grateful for our sponsors, our sponsor Necodex, that's NECODEX.com, and they're fantastic at building product and design. So if you're in need of assistance, they're based in Mexico, the price is right, they've done fantastic work for our community. And without any further ado, let's jump right into it. Welcome, guys, to the show. Maybe before we hop into it, we could do some quick introductions. Greg Tanaka, would you like to begin?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Nick, thank you for having us on. My name is Greg Tanaka. For those of you that can see the live stream, based in Palo Alto, I'm on a Palo Alto City Council, so I've been on the council for some time. I'm also in the AI space. I'm a technologist, so entrepreneur, done a lot of stuff around AI. So I'm really happy to be here and discuss more about SB 1047.
Beautiful, awesome.
Thank you, Nick, for having us on.
Yeah.
I'm Chris, the founder of Context Fund, which was one of the first open source groups to jump in and weigh in on SB 1047. Previously, I worked at Meta as an AI researcher, and originally came through Stanford. So long-time Bay Area resident, and happy to be here and chat.
Beautiful. Well, let's. I mean, this is a quickly changing issue. Obviously, SB 1047 was voted down. Things aren't always what they may appear to be. So perhaps for the audience at home, we could kind of set the stage and explain first what was 1047, and also who's behind it. In fact, would you like to start us off here?
Yeah. So I think 1047 was probably one of the largest U.S. Regulatory bills that was proposed nationwide at this point. Compared to in Europe, they had the EU AI Act. In California, we had this attempted 1047, proposed originally by Senator Wiener and sponsored by several research groups associated with AI safety. It was, as you mentioned, vetoed on September 29th. And so it was one of the largest bills in terms of the industry response. We had people like Nancy Pelosi weighing in on the bill, and 8 ranking members of the House Science Committee at the federal level. So not just a California bill, it became a federal issue. As Governor Newsom has said, it had its own weather system by the end of the cycle. So for us, it was from March until September or so. So, quite a long process, about 6 months there.
Yeah. And so, Greg, from a political perspective, was this something of an overreach? Was it? What are your first impressions when you heard about it, and then what do you feel now? Help us unpack that.
Yeah. So when a lot of people think about AI, they think of Terminator, right? Because a lot of what people know about AI is what they see from Hollywood. And Hollywood, if they make a movie that's kind of boring and not much happens, it doesn't sell tickets. So what Hollywood does is take what is the microphone won't stay.
Oh, there you go. You're good. Yeah.
Okay. Well, they take what is kind of I don't know.
Technical difficulties.
I try to just hold the mic.
If we lift that part up, it might be a little bit helpful.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah. So they take what is really boring stuff and make it exciting.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of fear that has been building up in Hollywood about AI, and 1047 is kind of a manifestation of that.
Sure.
It's basically kind of it's basically it's like a solution looking for a problem when there really isn't a big problem.
Yeah.
And so to say that SB 1047 was a overreach is an understatement. It is trying to solve something that really hasn't been a problem yet, with something that was very like heavy-handed, and that's why they got such a bad reaction from all the people that Chris just talked about.
Let's zoom out for a quick second, because I almost feel like the rules upon which sponsors kind of impose on these channels is through engagement. So the more clicks that they're going to get, the more visibility and all the rest. So it almost feels like this. Needs to be like a fundamental rewriting of how this medium is structured. Maybe like rather than just focusing purely on engagement, maybe it could also be like there needs to be like veracity and truth as well. So how do we codify that? Is that even possible? What do you guys think about this kind of general framework?
Yeah, so I think part of what you're talking about is kind of the intersection of social media and AI, right? When that's actually pretty salient in the case of SB 1047, because it would have set up a regulatory commission that would have been able to oversee the AI, that would have been able to change your newsfeed.
Yikes!
So super big impact, and actually very
kind of Big Brother vibes.
Very Big Brother-ish,
yeah.
In the sense that if you could make some statement that this would cause more than $500 million of damage in expectation, you would be able to prevent a model from being deployed. And this would be the decision of only around 24 people within that frontier model division.
Yeah. What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, so it really was, in our first, they softened the bill a little bit after a while, but we initially called it essentially a rootkit.
Wow. Okay.
So how do you control AI and a little bit indirectly social media through that? And so I think for us as Context Fund, we weren't trying to be political. We are mostly interested in the application of AI towards making social media more truthful, making some of our societal discord more truthful, and so we kind of got pulled into that because we saw that connection to social media and saw that connection to many of the other technologies that we use today.
Yeah, when you say truthful, I mean, real quickly, we get deep into the philosophical weeds.
Mm-hmm.
Can truth be codified, do you think?
Well, this is a great question.
No pressure.
No. So, I mean, the definition I normally give of truth is it's something that doesn't change.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily going to be the same thing for everyone, but it's a representation of the world that doesn't change.
Okay, that's an interesting model.
Yeah. And I think if you look, there's also the model of Platonic truth, the idea of everyone striving for some kind of mystical, kind of invisible representation that we can never get to. But I think if you define it in terms of representations that don't change, it's a lot more tractable to work with.
Yeah, I can imagine. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that truth is somewhat relative. I think what's truth to one person may be not the truth to another person. So it's a hard problem, and I think that's a problem when you kind of make this arbitrary, right? When you have like a law that has a kind of a nebulous boundary, it puts a lot of people who want to invest in this space in AI to try to bring this technology to market kind of in a very difficult position. And I think that's the big problem I had with SB 1047 is, well, who defines the truth? Because truth is relative. Is this AI model dangerous because I feel like it's dangerous, or is it really dangerous, right? So it's a very subjective thing. So that's why I think laws should be for actual harm, not just like these kind of vibes, like you have the bad vibe that it might be harmful. I think that's almost dangerous because what is, vibing badly for me may not be vibing badly for you. And who's the arbiter of that, right?
So am I to understand you have no distinction between objective truth and relativistic truth?
Well, I think, I'm an engineer, so I think of things very kind of black and white. I can think of like 2 + 2 is always 4, but even something as obvious as that, in some places, actually it's not, right? And so if you do certain kinds of math, it is not that. So that's why I think truth is somewhat relative to where you are in your frame of reference.
Okay. If you don't mind me digging a little bit deeper here, when would 2 plus 2 not equal 4? And I know that's a hypothetical, but if you could maybe give us an example of when.
Okay,
Yeah,
sure,
let's
sure,
take
yeah.
that.
So I'm going to get into like general relativity. Okay, so let's say, for instance, like in normal speed, if you're going, let's say 20 miles an hour, and then you throw a ball, or like let's say you threw a ball at another 20 miles an hour, that ball is now going 40 miles an hour, right? That 2 plus 2, or in this case 20 plus 20 is 40, right? But as you get into, let's say, relativistic speeds, right? Let's say 99.9% of the speed of light, that's no longer true. So in that case, 20 plus 20 is not 40, right? So
it seems a little bit of a stretch. I appreciate you taking a contrarian viewpoint here, but at some point, like we have to. Let's think about this in a brass tacks kind of a perspective, like kicking a small child, always wrong.
Yes,
right.
Generally.
So if we can say that is, what do you mean generally? Can you think of a good scenario?
Well, so you always so let's say you're kicking a small child, but out of the path of a car that's going to hit it, you would be a hero, right? So it's relativistic, and so it's hard to always say that something's always wrong or always right, because you always come with scenarios. There always be cases where no, actually that was okay, right?
So maybe intent is an important element of the equation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Speaking of intent, what do you think? What do you think was the original intent behind the authors of SB 1047?
Yeah, well, I think the claimed intent was safety. Safety is a very hard term to define. I think security is often a much easier term to define. Security, you can provide a certain level of safety within a certain context that's well defined.
Right.
Safety is very broad.
Safety can be like, this is for your own good, right? But it's like, wait a second.
It's very hard, and that's I think back to the Buddhist fable of I think it's the man that falls off his horse, and he as a result is injured, and so the question is this good or bad for the man? And of course, at the time he says, "Oh, it's really bad. I fell off my horse, I got injured." But then later, the general comes and he asked all the able-bodied men to go to war.
Mm.
And so now he realizes, no, actually falling off my horse was actually good. And so this kind of illustrates this problem with especially value, which was kind of one thing that you're getting at with safety. Safety requires a value system.
Sure.
And then the idea is that you want to maximize the positive value within that system. And so it's actually a concept that is just fundamentally hard to define, except in a very well-scoped context and a very well-defined area.
Yeah, so maybe in order to make a determination, first, perhaps we need to draw the parameters of a specific scenario.
Exactly.
And maybe there's probably some parallels between how artificial intelligence is being built and implemented, because that kind of leads us into edge cases and all the rest. So back to the bill itself. What do you think, Greg? What were the original intentions? Was this like we're going to create it first, so that way, because regulation of some flavor is coming.
Yeah.
And so maybe if we do it, we'll be able to get our fingerprints on it and kind of shift and shape this to where it's good for us, good for me, but not for thee or we. Whatever. You guys know what I mean, right? So how are you?
Yeah, I think SB 1047 was like, have you ever seen the movie Minority Report?
Of course.
Okay, so my dad actually was in the movie.
Wow.
He was an extra. So when he retired, he was an extra in a lot of movies. Minority Report was one of them. And it's a movie about these guys called precogs.
Yeah.
And for those that haven't seen it, basically it's these guys would sit in Nevada water and predict future crimes, and then you'd be arrested for future crimes.
Yeah.
So SB 1047 was kind of like that. So it's basically it's trying to predict future harms, and you'd be penalized for these future harms. You have to prevent these future harms, and otherwise you could go to prison. There's a lot of really dire things that could happen to you.
Sure.
And while I think Minority Report made for a good movie, making these kind of predictions of the future is kind of a cool movie, and it made for a box like a hit, box office hit. It's not reality.
Sure.
We don't live in a sci-fi thing where people sit in vats of water predicting the future. And so I thought it was an incredible stretch of imagination. And
it's a pretty clever concept.
Well, the thing about it is it puts an incredible regulatory burden on people who are just starting to emerge. Right now in the AI space, pretty much everyone's losing money. Everyone's investing heavily, everyone's losing money, nobody's making a lot. And the impact on society of AI so far has been minuscule, very, very little, right? Most people haven't really used it for anything useful. Maybe making some cat jokes or something like that, but pretty much nothing really useful.
That's a bold claim. We'll get back to that in a minute, but I'll let you finish your point.
Yeah. And so, a lot of what SB 1047 was about was this idea about safety. And safety is a term that has been overloaded in the AI space. So people talk about safety like, oh, it's not safe because it doesn't give me the correct JSON, right? So JSON's a particular computer for it, yeah. And people talk about safety like that. But when most people, the average human thinks about safety, they think about like, is my car going to explode, right? Or
would never, have structural issues in its lifetime, including if you had sold it to someone else, including if that person had gone on and made modifications to it that were, outside of your control, outside of your bounds of even understanding that. And that's what it was asking the developer to do. Now, there's a lot of places in the uses of AI where we do go ahead and put specific liabilities on specific use cases.
yeah,
But that was not the approach that was taken in 1047. It was basically you had to make this really complicated socioeconomic calculation subject in the original version to the penalty of perjury for some of these, which is a criminal offense,
Sure.
right? And then make that, and then also develop your model to be able to have this assertion that it's safe. And I think that's just something that we don't do for any technology.
Yeah.
Like you can't imagine, like, can I make an assertion about steel not being used to make a car that later goes and has an accident? Like, that's a ridiculous assertion to make. There's not something you can make, and yet that was kind of the idea that it was possible to make that type of assertion.
Yeah, so it's almost like they're defining where the burden of responsibility or liability is when the thing itself is changing.
Right.
And according to like Elon and a bunch of other folks, it's changing faster than any other technology that we've seen. I gotta say, I feel like hyper lucky to have both you guys here because you're both at the top of your space. And so let's double click just real quickly on the AI models. Where are you seeing the general trends moving? Because you mentioned like the base models, and it seems to be that we're reaching some kind of ceiling or threshold on just brute force compute. Maybe that's changing. What are you finding?
Yeah. So to give kind of an overview, we've benefited. Humanity has benefited from having this vast corpus called the internet, which we accumulated from decades of people writing things down and putting them together and organizing them, and as Google says, making the world's information universally useful for everyone. And we're basically taking the internet and kind of turning it into this essentially prediction machine.
Yeah.
And that's an approach that actually turns out to be very easy to do because it doesn't require defining a value system. And then you can go and fine tune a value system into that. So, but it does have kind of limits of how far it can go.
Sure.
And so it's the basic, that's like the basic, I would say, probably last 4 years or so.
Because before that we had convolutional neural networks.
And right, and basic, the early transformers were back like mid 2015s or so, and then, but it wasn't until we get this massive scale pre-training with the GPT models that you started to see these kind of really interesting, what they call zero-shot learning and things like that. And so right now we're exploring what essentially is something closer to kind of getting the language model to reproduce streams of consciousness that you might be able to see. Yeah, well, I mean, streams of consciousness used loosely here. It's it's like as you're deriving a math equation, that sequence of steps that you're working through, and maybe that might include backtracking, going back one space. That might include revisiting your axioms, maybe changing some of those axioms to be able to better fit that data. Sure. And the idea is that entire search path is something that we humans do well with training. We don't do it super well naively, but we do it well with training. And some of those paths are actually written down that we can start to copy and get machine to replicate. We don't really know how far this goes. Some of OpenAI's experiments they basically have looked and said, no, it doesn't seem like there's actually a limit to how far we can scale this. Broadly, this is called like test time compute or inference compute. And so the idea is that as you increase the amount of time that you give to the model after it's been given a task, that it may be able to better solve this task through this kind of search procedure.
Yeah, I think Jensen has echoed similar sentiments. And it seems like also like post training is kind of like pretty important element recently as well. But how is post training different from like HLRF, I think it's called, like where human in the loop, like
RLHF.
Yeah,
reinforcement learning from human feedback.
So how is post training different from that? Isn't it?
Well, so RLHF basically creates contrastive pairs of data, and it says this piece of data is better than this piece of data. So when you get a chance, output this first piece of data rather than the second one. It doesn't do anything with arbitrarily long sequences of test time inference, and it doesn't do anything with data that there are ways that you can kind of bootstrap what they call a synthetic reward model there, but it's had some challenges going beyond its original synthetic reward model. Okay. These approaches, what they're experimenting with is going a little bit more what we call off distribution from that reward model. Basically means that if you haven't seen these types of streams of consciousness in your training set, you can still work with them, you can still reproduce them. And that's what causes what you would call generalizability, which is what you see in something like ChatGPT.
And that's kind of what we're shooting for.
Yeah.
And I guess the frustration with some folks, it's these benchmarks are perhaps these models are being adjusted to accommodate these specific benchmarks, but in reality, which it's supposed to be measuring this kind of more generalized intelligence, right?
It's always hard. As soon as you write down a benchmark, your model is going to try to overfit to it. In humans, that's called Goodhart's law.
Okay.
Yeah, or overfit. I call it overfitting, because then you have to explain the whole story. But and that's also the term for machine learning. But it occurs in humans, occurs in models. It actually is really interesting because it connects back to the way that we look at social media and the way that we interact with social media, our behavior patterns. But that's another thread.
Oh, okay. That kind of dovetails into the reward mechanisms for media, like we had mentioned earlier.
Exactly. I think arguably one of the biggest challenges that we have with current social media, especially like the short kind of like 40 bytes for 40 characters type of media, is that it really encourages, it doesn't allow us to have sufficient context about where that information is coming from. And as a result, we tend to overfit to the content that we see. And so it's actually arguable. I think this actually may be one of the reasons that when you go to very short media and you're on there all the time, you actually end up kind of angry, depressed, like more aggressive with the world. This is a commentary that I've heard from people. Whereas if you zoom out, you stay on a community like Reddit or something like that, which does have a lot of context built into it. It's not just 40 characters.
Yeah.
It actually can be a much more calming effect. And we, as humans, we can process very large amounts of data, but we try to compress it to a small amount of data.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge.
How big is the context window for humans?
Oh, it's huge.
Okay.
So I mean, your entire perceptual field, your auditory stimulus, your episodic memory, all those hits that, as we're having this conversation, you might be remembering some insights from past conversations with other people on your podcast or things like that. That's your entire perceptual window.
Wow.
And so
that's a lot of bits per second.
It really is. Yeah. But the task of humans is to compress all that context into a very short string, and then contrast it with the other data that we've seen, and distill some little latent representations of the world. And this is a process that I've done a little bit of research into called contrasted distillation. So the idea is that you're trying to build contrasts and distill them into small pieces that you can put into your episodic memory.
And what percentage of that research was focused around the integrity of the information source?
A lot of it. So basically, models are kind of like sponges. They will try to predict and repeat whatever distribution you give them.
Yeah.
So if you give them junk, they're going to do junk. If they give them good stuff, they're going to do good stuff. And so there's the concept of having a value model, or for humans, a value system,
Sure.
to be able to rank and understand the context from which that emerges. And so all those little cues, that's what we call bounded rationality. So the idea that I can be rational, but within my context window. And once I exceed the length of my context window, or the size of my context window, that's the world of magicians. That's the world of kind of smoke and mirrors. And when you can create these illusory effects that exceed people's bounded rationality.
Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe that dovetails a little bit into the like when these models were hallucinating, or is that kind of what
exactly?
that
Yeah.
is? Okay.
So one of the things that we worked on context, and actually originally, before, we weren't trying to be a political group. we got roped into this because we were one of the first open source groups to notice 1047, realize that it impacted everybody in the Valley. But we were originally,
you guys were kind of like the first whistleblowers in this, weren't you?
We were the first organized group.
Yeah.
Very quickly after that, there was AFTF, Alliance for the Future, and then Dean Ball was the first kind of policy wonk to notice it, even before us. But we were the first open source group to notice. And then from that, that cascaded into YC getting interested, which A16Z got interested, and then you got to the lists of scientists that were writing opinions, and then eventually got to U.S. members of Congress and Nancy Pelosi weighing in.
Yeah, and now on Pirate Cat Radio.
Yeah, that's right.
And Greg, what was your first intention, or what was your first thoughts when you were reading about SB 1047?
Well, I first heard about it when it cleared the Senate, right? I heard like the rumors of it and the beginnings of it, but what really kind of threw me was how it flew through the Senate. So initially, when the California Senate voted on it, it passed, like, I think only one person voted against it. And it kind of shocked me, right? Because when I looked at it, it had a lot of really bad things in there. And when I actually talked to some of the members who voted on it, they said, we just wanted it to be heard. So that's why we voted for it. And I realized they really didn't understand it very well. And I was for me, I felt very passionate about this. And I was kind of surprised and disappointed that people voted for something they didn't really understand. But then
probably not the first time.
Well, so I'm on the city council for Palo Alto, and every Monday we have these meetings, and they go for 10, 12 hours long, and sometimes we have up to 50 items. And I thought back to myself as a council member where I'm voting on things, and if I'm not that particularly into it, I may understand it but not know all the details. And I think this is one of the many things that the California Senate was voting on. And so a lot of them voted for it without actually really knowing what it was about. And I think, unfortunately, that's dangerous. And I think that what we need is actually AI to help these legislators. So like for myself, like on city council, I take these staff reports and I put them into ChatGPT or Claude to help me understand it. Because the problem is that legislators are looking at lots of different things, and it's hard to be an expert on everything. And so these tools can actually help people understand things better. And so we work together to do some outreach to help educate some of the people and some of the lawmakers. And as people understood what was going on, they realized, oh, this is not so good. So I think what's interesting is not just what happened with SB 1047, but the fact that I think some of these AI tools can help us make better laws.
Yeah, very well put. And since we're at the halfway mark, I do want to do a quick station ID. You're listening to Silicon Zombies BrainWaves on Pirate Cat Radio. That's KPCR 92.9 in Los Gatos, KMRT 101.9 FM in Santa Cruz for BrainWaves. So do you think that, Greg, because I think that's a fantastic point, perhaps it would be interesting to have some kind of like a task force or a structure or model to inform and educate, in a as neutral way as possible, our legislators, because that's kind of where the rubber hits the road. And frankly, and this is no reflection of you, because you're at the epicenter of this, but there's a lot of folks that historically, especially at the federal level, are making legislation on things that they just don't understand. So how can we educate our legislators to make the best decisions for Americans?
Yeah, I think the first step is kind of like a doctor, do no harm, right? I think the Hippocratic Oath is do no harm. And so for me, I think if there's not harm happening, why have all this ruckus, right? And I think that's the problem with SB 1047 was there hasn't been really any AI harm at all. And there's this really onerous bill that people don't really understand. And so it's hard for them to even put their hands around. So I think what they should have done is wait for there to be an issue. Like if people are robbing a bank, you have a law about robbing a bank, right? But if you're basically trying to forecast a potential harm without actually knowing what it is. And so I think that's why SB 1047 kind of got wrapped around the axle, was because the legislators got ahead of themselves. But with that said, I think this is kind of a fast-moving space, and a lot of the legislators don't really understand everything. So I think partnering up with people that kind of know more about it, I think is really important. But I think the first step is, if there is not a problem, like, don't do anything. I think that's the first step.
This seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost seems like the philosophy you're suggesting is legislate after tragedy, which doesn't seem like a good philosophy to me because of the potential disastrous implications, especially when AI, it seems to be something of a runaway train.
Yeah.
My understanding is that certain models are talking to each other in a new language that humans can't understand. I don't know if that's like sci-fi or somebody who's pulling my leg, but regardless, don't you think that we, like an ounce of prevention could be a little bit more of a thoughtful approach here, Greg?
Well, I think most laws, the way they happen is they're put in place after there's some sort of incident, right? And it may not be a tragedy. It may be something, short of a tragedy. But most laws are like that, right? So like I've been on the Palo Alto City Council now for 8 years, and virtually all of the laws we pass, ordinances that we pass, are because there was a problem. I can't think of a time when we passed something where we passed it because there might be a problem.
That's a good point. Like, why would you fix something if it's not broken?
Exactly. And so the problem with the Senate, Scott Wiener, was he came up with a solution when there wasn't a really clear problem yet. And the problem with that is AI is a nascent industry. It's just getting started. Nobody's making money in this space, right? People pretty much are investing a ton of money, and there's not much return yet. And so it's a very embryonic, emerging technology that's very, very promising. And what's going to happen with things like 1047 is you're putting gigantic weight on top of it. It's like you're trying to grow like a little flower, and you're putting a gigantic, weight on it, and it's just squashing it, right? Yeah. And at the same time, if you look at countries like China, right? So China, they are investing in AI like you can't believe.
Sure.
So some of the top models now actually come from China. And China and the United States have this somewhat adversarial relationship. And for me, I think it's important that America is strong, that America stays number one. And if we, put a gigantic weight on top of this little flower that we're trying to grow, and China's going full bore, we could be at a technology disadvantage, right? We saw like recently, I think Russia launched a hypersonic missile into Ukraine, right? I don't think we have that technology yet, right? So I think the United States has been lucky because we've been military number one, technology number one, and economically number one. But if we don't stay at the forefront of technology, we let our adversaries become number one, I think there are a lot more tragedies that could happen.
Yeah. And, very well put. We kind of just dove headfirst into policy and innovation. But we also really like to understand about the human element. So Greg, maybe you mentioned it was 8 years that you've been on city council, but you've actually been in local civics for like a decade and a half. Isn't that right?
Yeah,
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, of course. I went to Caltech Berkeley. I engineer, electrical engineering, computer science, and I had like a big disdain for politics, right? I thought that was for some other people. And I first got into it because I was in a condo in Mountain View, and I wanted to put a laundry unit in my condo because I was on the 3rd floor and the coin-op laundry was on the 1st floor. And so I went to the HOA and asked them, hey, can I put a laundry unit in my little closet area? And they said, no, you can't do that. But they said, we have an opening for a treasurer. And these HOAs are desperate for any volunteers. So I volunteered for that. They got to know me, and it made me realize I could sit there and complain about something, or I could get involved, and actually get it done. And as they got to know me, pretty much they said, "Oh yeah, no problem," and pretty much everyone in the complex did it. And then it's like, wow, okay, it's like
that's an awesome story.
Yeah, so that's how I got involved. So I went from being very apolitical to being more involved. So now when we moved to Palo Alto, I lived in a neighborhood where there was a lot of cut-through traffic, and so I have little kids and so I became president of my neighborhood association. And then, from there, I went to planning commission, and then I got involved on city council because the mayor of Palo Alto at the time, back in 2016, he wanted to ban software development in Palo Alto. He wanted to make it illegal to do coding, like Python coding.
What?
In Palo Alto, yeah.
Wow.
And I thought, well, wait a second, this is where Google started. This is where Facebook started. This is where, HP, right? All these iconic companies started in Palo Alto, and you want to ban software. And it just
seems pretty reasonable, right?
so this is why I got involved. This is why I said, okay, this is ridiculous. So that's why I ran for city council. I won, and the first thing I did was legalize it because I think innovate.
You legalized software in Palo Alto.
Yeah, I know. Tell me about it.
That needs to be a T-shirt.
and so, the guy, I think he was, trying to get a lot of publicity. He made it a cover in New York Times.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. So mayor of Palo Alto trying to get rid of tech companies, but I think in politics, so often it's a zero-sum game, right? So often in politics, it's a game of taking something from one group and giving it to another group. But technology is one of those things that can grow the pie, something that's amazing where everyone could benefit. And software is one of those things where because of software, we could chat here, people could watch us, all over the world, people can become smarter because of technology. And technology is the one where, 2 + 2 doesn't have to be 4. 2 + 2 could be 6. Or 7 or 10, right? And I think that's why I'm such a proponent of technology. And also I ran for Congress at some point, and one reason I ran was because the current congressperson was trying to ban AI, and I'm like, what the hell? I don't think so, right?
Yeah.
So I thought that was wrong. So and so I'm a big proponent because I've seen what technology could do. Technology has increased their standard of living. We live longer and generally healthier with a higher quality of life because of technology. And for us to say, no, we don't want fire, so we die of food poisoning. We don't want refrigeration, so we starve. We don't want farming, so we have to work in the fields, right?
Yeah.
I think it's just wrong, and it holds back humanity because I think there's 8 billion of people on Earth, and more in general, 8 billion of us live higher standard of living than we did 100 years ago.
Yeah, even like the kings and queens.
Absolutely, because of technology. And so for people, especially lawmakers who don't really understand technology, to put the brakes on it, like they did with 1047, to me is just absolutely wrong. It's devastating, actually. You think about all the people that will not get a cancer treatment because of what 1047 could have done, or would have died in a car crash because of 1047. There's all the tragedies that would happen because this technology cannot happen. So like my dad, when he was little, he used to work in the field picking cotton by hand, right? It's crazy, my dad.
Yeah.
And today, that's all automated, and we have like cheap clothing. We have clothing now that we just throw away because it's so cheap because of technology. And so for me, we should not hold back technology. We should enable it because while SB 1047 may have prevented a few small tragedies, the bigger tragedy would have been, billions of people will suffer because they're not educated as well.
Yeah.
Billions of people would suffer because they died of leukemia because alpha fluid wasn't available. There'll be a lot more people. A lot more tragedies will happen by holding back technology than enabling it.
Sure. I love the idea of you getting into politics because you wanted to make an actual change, like something that hits you personally. It's like it's the old Soviet saying, you know, you may not care about politics, but politics cares about you. But so you actually ended up getting involved, and then, you know, like to your point about the economic repercussions, you know, it's the economy is defined as the economic output per person multiplied by the population. And if the economic output per person can like double, triple, 10x, and then all of a sudden we introduce robots into the mix, that in conjunction with energy becoming essentially like negligible cost or something close to free, yeah, the whole, we could crack this open, and then the quality of life could be just magnificent for everybody. Almost maybe something like of a golden age. Is that kind of what attracted you to the space initially, or give us a little bit of background on yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, we got involved with 1047 specifically because one of the companies that I've invested in, vCreate, would have been regulated by that. So vCreate is working on what are called foundation models for T-cell immunotherapies. Your immune system is this wonderful hunter-killer system that can target all types of things, including cancers, and can do it much more specifically than traditional methods of chemotherapy. But we don't yet have great models of rapidly reprogramming it to target specifically what you want to target. So AI can really help you with this.
Yeah.
And but because these models would have been regulated under 1047, it would have been much harder to release them, much harder to develop those treatments, much harder to develop that system, which I think already in some very limited instances is saving lives, not their model, but related models. Mm-hmm. For example, my aunt got cancer recently, and through some of the newer treatments that she was able to go into remission.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Sarah.
Yeah. We have some of these things that we can actually develop and make better with AI models, and it only takes the will to experiment and the ability to make some mistakes at small scales.
Yeah.
To make that happen. So I think that was really kind of one of the big driving forces that I've seen, and I know that there's enough progress being made with longevity technology. I know you're interested in that, and some of these other technologies that just make it a little bit into the weeds. But we have very complicated systems. Our bodies are made of very complicated systems, and we need AI to be able to predict how those systems are going to behave. And if we can predict how those systems are going to behave, then we have the ability to not just develop drugs for one disease, but develop drugs for what is normal.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea of kind of keeping your body in a normal homeostasis that excludes all the disease states that you could potentially treat for with these kind of one-off.
Yeah. Just like
projects.
turning it off, just like turning off the switch.
Exactly. Yeah. There's thoughts that aging may be partially pre-programmed, at least. So you might be able to turn parts of those off.
Senescence.
There's various theories. There's somewhat different models of aging, but for me, I think seeing all the things that you can do when you use AI to understand these very complicated systems that each of us depend on for life is one of the biggest things that kind of drove me to get into this 1047 bill specifically.
And where do you think things are headed from a policy perspective?
Yeah. So for 1047, Governor Newsom made it pretty clear. The next steps are going to be taken by a commission of 3 experts who he's kind of designated from the academic space and policy and think tank space. And he did pass in September, I think 17 other AI related bills, several of which have done things like force AI generated political advertisements to have labeling. So directly affects the ability of our elections to be fair and transparent, and then also force AI to have labels on its data sets. And so I think
like cigarettes with the skull and crossbones.
Other way. So one of the biggest principles around AI is the question of how many people are supervising it, and the way do you get more people to supervise it is you force it to be more transparent. Transparency.
Sunshine's the best. Yeah.
Disinfectant.
That's nice. I got that one in stereo over here.
So when you have transparency, you go from maybe 10 or 100 people who are looking at this model, which is kind of the way that kind of safetyist perspective had it. And then you get tens of thousands of scientists who can actually look at it, supervise it, kick the tires, and look at how do we make this not only safer but also better. And so those transparency laws, like this is AB 2013 for those that are interested, really do make a huge difference in the long run. And so that's why, like, you know, the safety, not safety theater is really important to get it right.
Yeah, you know, I think that AB 2013 is kind of a, it's like, you know, like your cereal box, you know, how you have the ingredients. It's kind of like that, but for training data, right? So basically, what kind of training data went into the model?
And how do we, okay, my wife uses this application, she's the Whole Foods or whatever, it scans the brand or the product, and it'll say, hey, this is Bobby approved or not Bobby approved. If it has it, probably some health nut.
Okay.
Yeah.
He made his own app.
Xanthan Gum and all these, you know, the chemicals that you can't provide, they don't make the cut. So what kinds of things wouldn't make the cut in this example?
Well, so this is just labeling. Transparency makes no assertions about value. And it's up to the end user to determine what the value is.
Okay.
But without transparency, you can't have an idea of value.
Right. But I mean, people are looking for heuristics on what they can and cannot trust.
Yes.
So how should we approach that?
So the idea
or how should developers approach that?
Yeah. So value has to be set within a specific use case. So in this case, your wife is looking at it and saying, I'm going to consume this.
Yeah.
This is my use case. And the developer is not just, you know, taking corn and turning it into ethanol. They're taking corn and turning it into a very specific product for a very specific person at a very specific time. That's the point when you can assess safety, and you can also assess value. You know, does this thing do what its promises to do?
I see.
And so where your model developers are making these assertions are kind of in the process of developing products, in the process of testing them with small pilot customers, in the process of sharing their findings with the scientific community as white papers. And they're all looking and saying, our model is supposed to do X, and we would also you know, like you to make sure that it doesn't do other things besides X. And that's how we're kind of going to assess whether these models are high value or not.
Got it. We've got a pretty sophisticated audience of founders and friends.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if we could jump into the weeds real quick.
Sure.
Are there any interesting white papers that you've read recently, or some kind of like aha moments that?
So I mean, I think this test time compute or inference time compute, that's the approach that we've been pushing for oh man, it's been almost 3 years now. And looking at different ways that we can find the right contrastive data sets by looking for different, in common speak would be like resonances with episodic memory. I think there's several papers from Meta which start to look at aspects around that. And then there's, of course, OpenAI has been working on inference time compute and some other approaches there.
So I was doing some research, and we'll see if this works. Hold on.
Test time compute refers to the computational resources and time required to run a machine learning
It's doing my job for me.
model after it has been trained, specifically during its inference or testing phase. This is when the model makes predictions or decisions based on new, unseen data. Key characteristics
When they say
of test time
unseen data, this isn't what you're referring to when you say synthetic data, right?
It's related.
Okay.
Synthetic refers to the fact that it's been artificially generated, but you can generate it in distribution or out of distribution. That would relate to kind of the unseenness of it.
I see.
In this case, you're looking at synthetic out of distribution data, or even data that starts in distribution but then goes out of distribution.
Got it. And Greg, when we think of alignment in these models, I think that helps us understand like if what's being created, and is it ultimately, is the utility worth it? How are you looking at this from a political perspective? And also if you could maybe share us a little bit with what your next steps politically are.
Oh, okay. Well, I still in the city council. I'm termed out actually end of this year, and for me, I pretty much more issue based, right? If there's an issue that I care about, I'll get involved. So I got involved on 1047 because I was really motivated by that. But if there's not an issue, then hey,
Yeah.
the people who want to do it, right?
Let
So
the HOA keep doing what they're
yeah,
doing.
exactly. So I'm much more motivated by a particular issue that I care about. So like for instance, I went on the planning commission because I always wanted to live near University Avenue in downtown Palo Alto, but couldn't afford it. So I lived near California Avenue. So I wanted California Avenue to be more vibrant. So I led to the streetscape improvement there. So for me, whenever I serve in a way which I think will make society better.
Oh, so what's in alignment for you personally?
You mean for AI?
I mean to say, when you get involved, it's because something that matters to you personally. So you're in alignment there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like, so I think California Avenue has always been kind of sleepy, and by basically like I did a couple of things. One thing was to have a streetscape, and then the second thing was to actually lead to closure, so that basically it becomes like a pedestrian mall. So those are two things, and I think it made the area better, more vibrant.
Yeah.
So for me, usually when I get involved, it's something which I see that will be beneficial to I think to people, right?
Yeah.
And so that's generally how I'm motivated. I generally don't see myself as a politician, so to speak, where
Yeah.
I feel like, oh, I gotta be this or that or whatever. For me, it's more like, what do I want to get done?
Yeah. Which that's the best kind of politician. It's, so in your aspirations moving forward. And so in fact, maybe if you could share how folks can get in touch with you,
Yeah.
and what does the next chapter look like for Greg Tanaka?
Yeah, well, you can go to my website, so gregtanaka.org, and you can contact me there and see kind of things I'm interested in. So for me, right, I'm very focused on AI. I think AI is one of the biggest technologies in our lifetime.
Yeah.
I think it's bigger than the internet. I think it's bigger than mobile. It's bigger than a lot of things we've seen before. And so for me, I want to be involved in this. So I'm working on an AI startup. I think there's not that many big technological waves that come in our lifetime.
Yeah.
And this is one of them. And when it's happening, you want to be with it, right?
Yeah,
And
you want to get barreled.
yeah, exactly. And so for me, it's using this technology, and I think the deployment of the technology is just starting. It's like the early days of this space. And so I think it's probably one of the best times to do a startup, because it's like a, what do you call it, blue ocean, right? There's so much opportunity right now.
You mentioned working on a startup yourself. How much can you share about that? Like, what problem are you solving? How is it unique?
Yeah, so it's in the healthcare space, and so as we know, healthcare has been one of those really challenging areas, and I think that there's so much opportunity. If you look at housing, education, healthcare, all of them have really suffered a lot, so I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and hopefully we could serve and make people healthier with less effort.
Yeah, maybe make America healthy again.
Yeah, something like that.
It is happening.
Yeah, and what about yourself, Chris? What's next for you?
Yeah, well, I think Context Fund, we've been continuing to work on basically pushing the boundary around verification, and basically building tools that are going to be helpful for sorting through this kind of complex web of information that we have.
So you wouldn't be replacing Active Directory then, would you?
So personal AI, which is kind of the all-encompassing product that we're looking at, potentially could replace a lot of things.
Sure. Yeah.
Active Directory being one of them. But I think the most important thing that it can potentially help us to do is refocus on what's important for us and what's long-term valuable for us. Because I think there's this idea that the state of the art is a news feed in terms of how you consume the world, and what we see from AI is that is not at all the case. So yeah, www.context.fund. We have a lot of interesting kind of much deeper dives compared to what we've talked about here today, but it's definitely very useful if you're interested in learning more about that.
And are you approaching it like a DAO of sorts? In fact, can you maybe describe for the audience what a DAO is?
Yeah, so DAO is decentralized autonomous organization. We're not directly so we have some similarity in the sense that we think about verification and we think about truth, which is one of the core ideas of crypto. But we're looking at verification of very abstract concepts, things that are hard to verify, things that are hard to kind of assert truth about,
Yeah.
and trying to arrive at a probabilistic estimate of truth.
And the modality you're talking about, like text, not like a modality like, oh, this is a deep fake, this is an authentic picture. That's not what you're talking about, right?
So images are definitely in there. Any type of input media can be in there. DAOs typically work with just finance, numbers, zeros or ones. I have a dollar in my bank account, or I don't have a dollar. With text and with most real world data, then this concept of truth is much more ambiguous. And so we're looking at trying to build models that can understand truth more deeply.
Got it. Yeah, when we first met at Stanford, that was a super fun party. So glad I got to connect with you fellows. One of the things that resonated was your approach, or I should say Context Fund's team's approach at figuring out what problems need to be solved. And then how can you allocate capital to solve these challenges? It almost struck me as kind of like a nonprofit of some sorts. What was the philosophy behind that kind of architecture, Chris?
Yeah, so I think that at the end of the day, we're going to see much more long-term thinking in terms of what types of things are we building. And we specifically, that kind of structure that we've been looking at is looking at public investment. So VC investment traditionally is looking at how do we return profits back to our shareholders within a time frame of around 10 years. Public investment says, how do we return profits to the entire world in a time frame of around 100 years? Mm-hmm. Traditionally, public investment is very underrated and underinvested. Underrated because it generally drives a lot more downstream change than we think. So for most open source technology, for example, it's estimated that we generate, I think, 100 times the impact of the value that gets captured.
Say that one more time. You're generating 100 times the impact that is, sorry?
Yeah, so if you think about value generated, the value generated for shareholders is 1/100th of the value generated for society.
Oh, yeah.
From open source
I
technology.
see.
Yeah, and that's also why open source technology generally is you're not going to get super wealthy being an open sourcer, but you are going to really drive downstream change. And these kind of base models or these foundational models, not only of AI but also operating systems and things like that. That's why we have the technology and the society that we do today and that's why also we have the freedoms that we do today, because you don't have freedom to build models and build on top of each other. It's very easy for society to become very tightly clustered.
Sure.
And that actually has this long-term negative effect on the overall economy.
And do you think, like, put yourself in Tim Cook's shoes for a quick second, that closed ecosystem and compared to like all these teams that are using Hugging Face and these models, would you be nervous if you're Tim Cook at this point?
So there's kind of different structures. So generally, when you look at value creation structures, you're looking at open source structures. And then when you look at value capture structures, which also exist, you're looking at closed source and verticalized structures. So open source tends to be kind of horizontal companies. I'm going to build an operating system, but I'm not going to really think about the downstream uses. Versus a vertically integrated company is saying, I want this specific use at this specific time, and I want to own my entire supply chain that's going to produce the product out to that. And there's definitely use cases for both, and there's spaces in the world for both. Longer diatribe, but
definitely handled curveball.
Anyway, there's a longer diatribe,
notes over here.
but I think there's in general, horizontal companies and open source ecosystems are great for creativity and value creation. And then there's value capture mechanisms that will come on top of them. And it depends on the time and your competition of whether you want to invest in a vertically integrated versus a horizontally integrated company.
And that's actually one of the big things I really didn't like about SB 1047 is the people that would be impacted the most would be startups, open source people. And I think, like you said earlier, transparency is like disinfecting, right? It really, so one way to make things safe, so to speak, is actually to be open source. And so ironically, SB 1047 was going to hurt the things that would make it most safe. And that just didn't make sense.
Right. I think transparency has a huge impact on security and safety because you have, there's this saying, with enough eyes, all bugs are shallow. And that's certainly what we've seen with things like Llama, where many of the problems with Llama have been sorted out and sussed out by the community. And over time, that's actually become a much more trustworthy model than something that you don't really have the ability to poke and prod.
Fantastic. Well, guys, we're at the end of the hour. This has been so fun. Chris and Greg, really appreciate the time, both you fellas. And let's be sure to play the song. And And also, you've been listening to Pirate Cat Radio, or I should say Silicon Zombies, on Pirate Cat Radio. That's KPCR 92.9 FM in Los Gatos, KMRT 101.9 FM in Santa Cruz. Until next time, be good to yourselves and be good to each other. Thank you guys for coming on.
Thank you, Nick.
All right, cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Right on.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cool.